Hey guys, welcome to my channel and welcome to part 2 of my Axial SMT10 Max D upgrade series. In this part of the series we're going to be upgrading the axles and part of the drive shafts. We will be replacing the diff gears in the rear with these Boom Racing heavy duty steel gears. We'll be replacing the drive shaft with the MIP X-Duty C-Drive kit for the SMT10. We'll be adding extra speed axle tubes in both the front and the rear. We'll be adding Boom Racing HD steel axle shafts for the rear. We'll also be adding Vanquish Products rear axle lockouts, as well as SSD knuckles. Alright, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the axles off the truck and we'll get started. Alright, we've got the axles removed from the truck and we're going to start with the rear axle first. Alright, now we've got the rear axle completely taken apart. Time to start with the Boom Racing heavy duty helical gear, as well as an Axial HD diff locker. Alright, so the stock rear diff comes with spider gears, and I'm going to take these gears out, clean it up, and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've cleaned out the diff housing since I don't need grease for the diff gears anymore, and I'll be putting in the Axial heavy duty locker. Alright, like I said, we're going to be using these Boom Racing heavy duty diff gears. As usual, what I like to do for the gears is I like to use Versachem brake caliper grease. And I like to give it a few turns just to spread the grease out. Just make sure it's nice and smooth. Alright, just double check that everything's still moving smoothly, and we can move on to the axle tubes. Okay, the next step is to put these extra speed axle tubes into the axle. Now when you put these axle tubes into the axle, you want to make sure that this part lines up. The long side seems to always be a little bit more difficult to get into the axle, so once I get it in, I'll be right back. Okay, I've got the axle tubes inserted in, as you can see here. And it's time to put the link mounts back on. Now make sure you only put one screw in each, or else you won't be able to get the axle shafts in. Now for the axle shafts, once again we're using the Boom Racing HD steel axle shafts for tubes. Now, I will not be using the regular axial lockouts. I'll be using these Vanquish lockouts right here. They're clamping lockouts. Okay. Alright, so we've got the axle tubes back in. We've got the diff gear, HD diff gears in place, as well as the Vanquish rear axle lockouts in place. So the next thing we're going to do is to put the axle tubes into the front axle, and we'll be back after I get this all off. Okay, I've removed the carrier hubs as well as the steering link and knuckles from the front axle. I actually won't be using any of this later on, but for now we'll focus on the axle itself. In order to move the axle shafts, you have to remove at least one of the screws for the link mount. So that would be this. But since we're adding axle tubes, we're going to have to remove both of them anyway. Alright, now with the link mounts removed as well as the axle tubes removed, you'll need to actually remove one more screw, which is the top one here. And we're ready to put the axle tubes in. Once again, you want to make sure that the tube is lined up with the link mount screw holes. Right there. Should be like that. The short side is easier to put in. There, fully in, link holes are clear. So once again, when you're putting the link mount, what I usually do is I put the link mounts back on, but just to keep the axle tube in place. But what you do is you only put one of the screws on, because you can't put both of them on. If you put both of the screws in, you can't put the shafts back in. So I usually just put the bottom one in and leave the top one open. Alright, so now I know the tube won't rotate inside the axle housing. Now the next thing you want to do is to put the long side of the tube in. Make sure that the notches are on the outside. Once again, in my experience, the long side of the tube is usually harder to put in, but it really depends on the axle housing. Luckily, it seems like it went in easily today. Great. So we'll put on one of the screws for the link mount again, just to hold it in place. And now we're ready to put the axles back into the axle housing. Alright, we've got the axle shafts back into the axle housing, and now we're ready to put on the carrier hubs, and later on put the rest of it on. So first thing we'll do, put on the carrier hubs. Alright, with the carrier hubs back on, we can go ahead and put the rest of the screws for the link mounts back on as well. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to put these SSD knuckles on. Okay, so these are the SSD HD knuckles that I'm going to be putting on the front axle. Alright, and now we have the SSD knuckles on the axle. Next we're going to be putting the bottom half of the MIP drive shafts onto the axles and saving the top half for when we get to the suspension part of the series. Alright, we'll now be connecting the lower half of the MIP drive shafts to the axles. Okay, you've got the lower half of the MIP drive shafts attached to the axles. We've got the SSD knuckles on the front axle as well as extra speed axle tubes inside. On the rear axle we also have the MIP drive shaft, Vanquish lockouts, boom racing axle shaft, as well as boom racing steel gears inside here, and extra speed axle. And that pretty much concludes part 2 of the series. Thanks for watching.